Welcome to the program. You're with Arise News in Nigeria's capital, Abuja. Ahead over the next 60 minutes, all of the global headlines you need to know about. I'm Charles Anyegolu, and you're watching Arise News Hour. Our top stories. Ukraine says Russia has carried out its largest ever drone attack on its territory. Most of the country was under air raid warnings overnight. That war is being discussed by the G7 nations today, even as it remains unclear whether the US will continue to provide Kyiv with military aid once Donald Trump becomes president. We have analysis. Sudan's army head and de facto president has authorized the UN to establish supply hubs to deliver humanitarian aid. The war, which has been continuing for more than a year, has triggered an acute humanitarian crisis amid gross violations of human rights. I'll be joined in the studio by a member of the UN fact-finding mission on Sudan. And Israel's Security Cabinet appears poised to sign a ceasefire deal with the militant Lebanese group Hezbollah, ending months of conflict that's displaced more than 1 million people in Lebanon. It comes as Israel carried out massive airstrikes on Beirut. We have the latest. Plus, China has warned that no one would win a trade war in response to Donald Trump's threat to increase tariffs on day one of his presidency. Mr. Trump said he would impose additional tariffs on all imports from China, Canada, and Mexico. First tonight, Ukraine has said that Russia launched a record 188 drones in overnight attacks on the country. Ukraine's military says it shot down 76 of them. The vast majority of Ukrainian territory was under air raid warnings overnight, and Ukraine has continued to strike inside Russia with Western-supplied weapons. Well, that war is being discussed by the G7 nations today. They are, of course, the economically powerful nations that have backed Ukraine so far. But it is unclear whether the United States will continue to provide Kyiv with military aid once Donald Trump becomes president. He said he'd end the conflict in a day, but hasn't said how.
Rescue operations at the sites of the Russian missile strikes have now been completed. In Kharkiv, 25 people were injured in what was preliminarily an S-400 strike. In Odessa, 11 people were injured, with preliminary reports indicating an Iskander missile was used. These attacks targeted civilian infrastructure, ordinary residential areas. We will definitely respond to Russia for everything it does. It is crucial that these attacks, each one of them, do not go unanswered, not only by us. There must not even be a hint of normalizing Russian terror or becoming desensitized to it. Today, there is a new decision from the United Kingdom regarding sanctions on Russia's shadow tanker fleet. 30 tankers have been sanctioned. This is an important step, and it would be right for European partners, on the whole EU level, as well as other partners, to support such sanctions.
And that's President Volodymyr Zelensky there. Well, for more on these stories, I'm joined now on the line from London by the European Affairs analyst, Dr. Marrick Lovich. Good to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. So let's start with those attacks on Ukraine, a very loud night of drones in that country, I gather.
In a sense, it's nothing more than a kind of logical step for Russia. You see, if you send over 10 drones, the likelihood they will all get shot down. If you send over 200, the likelihood as many gets through. It's actually the same tactic as used in nature. That's why, for example, some species have huge amounts of spawn, and therefore on the assumption some will make it. And therefore, that there are so many drones coming through is not necessarily an example of how Russia's scaling up, but rather that it is a tactic that more gets through. But either way, it is, of course, a large and unpleasant night for the Ukrainians.
Actually, that's a very interesting point you make there. And a lot of those drones targeted, from what I understand, energy infrastructure. We're hearing that parts of western Ukraine near the Polish border were hit quite hard, and their energy facilities were hit. And with temperatures hovering around freezing at the moment, it could cause quite a bit of hardship for people there, couldn't it?
Yes, the goal is, if you like, to morale. Morale is key to winning the war. And therefore, if the morale of the people can be sapped by such attacks and by the discomfort that they caused, that is an important part of the strategy. Added to which, Russia has now increased the pace at which it is winning back territory, that in the Kursk region, and also winning new territory in eastern Ukraine. And these combined effects may well have a combined effect on Ukraine in the sense of as a nation. And therefore, this is the reason why he's doing it.
And I mean, we've seen in the last few months, just buttressing the point that you're making there, Dr. Laskiewicz, the Russian drones and missiles attacking Ukraine's energy infrastructure to try and ensure that, as somebody put it, Ukrainians have a dark, cold, miserable winter.
There is that, but it has to be pointed out. There is another very simple reason as well. You cannot run industry on fresh air. Electricity is vital today everywhere, offices, factories, government offices, of course, as well. And it follows logically that by taking out the energy structure, it's a sort of panacea target, if you like, that might well bring down the whole of the Ukrainian logistics operation, as well as causing discomfort. I've mentioned discomfort in my previous point, and I want to emphasize that there is actually a military aspect to this, which is an industrial as well, which is very important. The same idea was in World War II when they tried to destroy the German ball bearing factories on the basis that you need ball bearings everywhere. Exactly the same logic comes here. If they can indeed disrupt the electricity supplies for a substantial amount of time, it will have an impact on the logistics and on the operations of Ukraine as an industrial and military nation.
And if they were to hit that energy infrastructure really hard, do you see the potential for more Ukrainians to leave the country if that energy infrastructure is damaged yet further?
Well, exactly. The point is that when you're dealing with the people here, that the morale or the lack of it is shown by the number of people who are, so to speak, don't want to carry on. And one way you can tell this is they try to leave the country. The same was true of Russia before. When he increased the draft, if you remember Putin, the reports of Russians trying to make it across the frontier in various places, which showed the war was, to some extent, not fully supported. Precisely the same comes here. If we see more Ukrainians leaving the country, then in that sense, that will show that the morale is going down.
So, I mean, we've got the G7 foreign ministers meeting today to discuss what is happening in Ukraine. We're also hearing from Germany's defense minister, Boris Pistorius, that a new NATO mission is to be set up to coordinate military aid for Kyiv. I mean, do you think this is an attempt to try to offset any new action by Donald Trump if he decides to reduce the amount of American aid or perhaps even cut it off entirely?
Quite right. That is indeed the point. It has also been stated, it should be added to your comment, which was very good, that Europe itself is trying to pull itself up, do something, and basically get more aid over to Ukraine. And so this is, if you like, part and parcel of the same effect of trying to do without the states. It has to be said, whilst it's a very valiant attempt, and one does hope it succeeds, the key player is still going to be Donald Trump. And therefore, in that respect, this will not suffice, either in terms of quality of arms or in terms of quantity. However, it's undoubtedly a morale booster for the Ukrainians and for President Zelensky himself.
And looking, for instance, Dr. Laskiewicz, at what happened in Romania with the election of a pro-Russian winner. Do you think that if America does decide to turn off military aid to Kyiv, that other European countries may just follow, and that there is now much less support for Ukraine in Europe than there was a couple of years ago?
Actually, that's an interesting question, because there was actually no real support for Ukraine at the start. The German chancellor at one point said, it's a pity Ukraine didn't surrender to stop this war from taking place. So initially there was none. I think our views are colored by Poland, because Poland from the word go said it would support Ukraine. But the rest of Europe was very dragging its feet for a long time. It's only recently that Europe has started to come into the game at all and has started to vociferously, so to speak, support Ukraine and indeed provide arms. However, it has to be pointed out, with all this, there is actually an economic constraint. How? This is what Donald Trump was also indicating. His views are not purely based on the fact of the color of his wallpaper, but on the fact that America, how long can it afford to carry on forking out billions of dollars? The same applies to Germany, the same applies to Europe, especially to poorer countries like Romania, and that therefore there is an economic constraint, which I think has to be here fully emphasized. And this is another reason why support for Ukraine, I believe, certainly may well fall in the future, because it's not clear that Europe and the NATO nations without America can carry even remotely what America was doing.
So Ukraine likely to be living in a tougher neighborhood, in a manner of speaking.
Quite so. But you see, this is where President Zelensky really ought to do something. One of the problems has been, I mean, he was elected, by the way, that he could deal with the then uprising in eastern Ukraine, which he failed to do. He simply stated that it must remain part of Ukraine, that's his Donetsk and Luhansk. But also on top of that, he has significantly failed to ever suggest any peace proposals apart from the fact that Russia must leave entirely. And at one point, he wanted the Russians tried for war crimes and so on, and they have to pay reparations. If he is unable to provide any peace terms which make sense, and I do suspect that in the medium term, he will lose support, because people simply don't see an end to the war on his terms. And therefore, he, in the tougher neighborhood, as you should put it, should also put on his thinking cap and restructure his approach.
As always, very interesting, very insightful analysis. To Marrick Laskiewicz, thank you very much indeed. He is the European Affairs Analyst, and he was talking to me on the line there from London. Thank you ever so much.